A stranger checked in one stormy night, but no one ever saw them leave. Welcome to Midnight Confessions. I am your host, Danny. This community's amazing. Tell me where you're watching from tonight. Your comments mean the world to me. Let's begin. It was a most agreeable afternoon in the village of St. Aldhelm's Rest, a place that prided itself on two things above all else: its spotless teacups and its spotless reputation. The hedgerows were clipped to perfection, the cottages wore their ivy, like respectable old ladies wore pearls, and even the church clock, which had a habit of running 3 minutes slow, had been corrected in time for the spring fete that coming weekend. At the heart of the village stood the Laurel's Guest House, run by Mrs. Phillida Burnham, a brisk, rosy-cheeked widow who had turned her late husband's large country home into a respectable boarding establishment. Her guests were typically of the quiet sort: retired colonels, widows of the gentler kind, and the occasional traveling vicar. That Tuesday, however, she received a guest who, though polite, brought with him the faintest whiff of unease. He signed the ledger as Mr. Adrian Harcourt of London, a tall, distinguished man in his early 40s, with hair greying at the temples and eyes that darted, rather like a sparrow that had found its way into the wrong garden. Mrs. Burnham, ever the hostess, gave him her warmest smile, though she noted, in that instinctive way women of her generation did, that he had the look of someone not entirely at rest with himself. "Breakfast is served at 8, Mr. Harcourt," she said, handing him the key to room 3, overlooking the rose garden. "Ah," he replied, his voice smooth and cultured. "I do appreciate peace and order, Mrs. Burnham. One finds so little of it these days." There was nothing overtly strange in the remark, yet something in the way he said it, a slight tremor perhaps, lingered in her thoughts long after he had ascended the staircase with his suitcase. That same evening, the village assembled at the vicarage for what Reverend Copley insisted was to be a modest but cheery gathering to discuss the fete preparations. Among the attendees, seated quietly with her knitting needles clicking at a steady rhythm, was Miss Jane Marple of St. Mary Mead, visiting her old school friend, Mrs. Caroline West. Though Miss Marple had not meant to involve herself in village matters, she was always, by the quietest degree, attuned to the world around her. She had already heard by way of Mrs. West's gardener that the Laurels had a new guest. The way gossip travelled in small places was something Miss Marple found both amusing and instructive, for what people said, and more importantly, how they said it, revealed more than they ever intended. Mrs. Burnham, too, was there, naturally, a woman of practical energy and brisk manners. Over cucumber sandwiches and seed cake she mentioned in what she thought was a casual tone that she had a new lodger. "Very gentlemanly, very quiet," she said, "though I dare say he jumps at the sound of his own shadow." "London sort, perhaps," observed the Reverend, sipping his tea. Miss Marple looked up mildly. "It is often the quietest visitors," she murmured, "who have the loudest pasts." No one paid much mind to that at the time. By the following morning, St. Aldhelm's Rest had its first genuine scandal in decades. Mrs. Burnham found the door to room 3 still locked at 9 o'clock, the breakfast tray untouched outside. By 11, when no response came, she summoned the constable. Together, they forced open the door. Mr. Adrian Harcourt lay on the floor beside the writing desk, lifeless, his face pale as chalk, one hand clutching an overturned teacup. On the desk sat a half-finished letter addressed simply, "My dearest Clara." The village, needless to say, was electrified. By the time the police arrived from Melchester, speculation had already rippled from the vicarage to the grocer's, from the postmistress to the milkman. Some said heart failure, others whispered poison. Mrs. Burnham was in tears, the constable was out of his depth, and Miss Marple, seated that same afternoon in Mrs. West's parlour, listened quietly to every scrap of gossip that floated her way. She said very little. Only, as she looked out the window toward the laurels, her eyes narrowed slightly. Not in suspicion, but in the calm, measured curiosity of a woman who had seen too many peaceful villages to believe in coincidence. By afternoon, the village of St. Aldhelm's Rest hummed with scandal the way a beehive hums after being struck with a stick. The baker's wife heard from the postmistress that Mr. Harcourt's death was most unnatural. The milkman swore he'd seen a stranger loitering near the laurels the night before, though no one else could confirm it. Even the vicar's normally serene wife had been overheard declaring that she was quite certain there was something in that tea. Mrs. Burnham, meanwhile, was beside herself with agitation. The once spotless order of her establishment now lay disturbed by police boots and whispers. She wrung her hands, fluttered between the parlor and kitchen, and spoke in tremulous sentences about how kind Mr. Harcourt had seemed, how he had thanked her for the tea only the night before, and how, oh, it made her blood run cold, he'd asked whether anyone ever came to the laurels unexpectedly. Miss Marple sat quietly in the corner of Mrs. West's drawing-room, her knitting needles moving with calm precision. She listened as the latest tidings came in through Mrs. West's maid, who was every bit as efficient at collecting gossip as she was at serving tea. The older lady did not interrupt. She rarely did. Yet her eyes were alive with that curious, unspoken intelligence that seemed to note everything and judge nothing, at least not aloud. Later that day, Inspector Finch from Melchester arrived, a broad man with a thin patience and a thicker mustache. He interviewed Mrs. Burnham in the sitting-room while half the village watched from the hedgerows. To his mind, the matter was straightforward. A guest had died after drinking tea. There was a faint, bitter residue in the cup. Poison, most likely accidental, but possibly not. Finch favored simple explanations. Miss Marple, however, believed that simplicity was often the mask of something more intricate. That evening, Mrs. Burnham's maid, a timid girl named Elsie, came to the vicarage in tears. She'd heard the inspector saying that he meant to arrest her employer on suspicion of serving poisoned tea. "But, ma'am," she cried to Mrs. West, "Mrs. Burnham would never hurt a fly. She said herself she didn't even brew it. Mr. Harcourt did, right there in his room. She just sent the hot water up." Miss Marple looked up sharply. "He brewed his own tea," she repeated softly. "Now, that's rather curious, isn't it?" Mrs. West frowned. "Surely there's nothing odd about that, Jane. Perhaps he was particular about his tea." "Indeed, my dear Caroline," Miss Marple said mildly. "I've known many people particular about their tea, but very few who travel with their own teapot, and fewer still who die drinking from it." By the next morning, the rumors had doubled, then doubled again. Some said Harcourt had been a government man, perhaps a spy. Others insisted he'd been blackmailing a local resident. The postmistress swore he'd received a letter marked "confidential" only 2 days before his death. Someone else claimed to have seen him arguing with a stranger on the footpath near the churchyard at dusk. Amid all this, Miss Marple took a short walk through the village lanes, stopping at the laurels. Mrs. Burnham, pale and exhausted, was grateful for the company. The old lady's gentle sympathy seemed to soothe her in a way the constable's questions had not. "I can't think how it happened, Miss Marple," Mrs. Burnham said, dabbing her eyes. "He seemed a troubled man, yes, but polite. Very particular, like I said. He'd asked for quiet, said he had letters to write. He'd taken his tea tray every evening to his room. I never thought, Miss Marple patted her hand. "No, of course you didn't, dear. Few of us do. It's only when something dreadful happens that we begin to wonder whether there was something in the tone or the way a hand trembled or perhaps an unnecessary word." She paused. "You say he wrote letters?" "Oh yes, every evening. There were several envelopes in the wastebasket, all torn up. The inspector took them." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Letters tell so much and so little, depending on what's left unsaid." Her gaze drifted toward the staircase. Did you notice, by chance, whether any of his papers went missing?" Mrs. Burnham looked startled. "Why, no. But come to think of it, there was a small notebook he carried in his breast pocket. I saw it when he checked in. The police didn't find it on him, though they searched." "That is interesting," Miss Marple said softly. "Things that vanish are often more telling than those that remain." Outside, the village bell struck 3. A thin mist had begun to creep up from the meadows, curling against the hedges and chimneys like a living thing. Somewhere, in that quiet afternoon, a dog barked once and then fell silent. Miss Marple left the laurels with her knitting bag tucked under her arm and a far-away look in her eyes. She did not speak of her thoughts, but she had already noticed 2 things no one else had mentioned: the faint trace of a man's boot print beneath the guest-house window, and the curious fact that the key to room 3 had not been found in the lock, but on the writing desk, beside the unfinished letter. As she walked back toward the vicarage, the sun dipped behind the clouds, and the tranquil village once more seemed to hold its breath. Something, someone, was not as they appeared. Miss Marple, though gentle as ever, felt the first cool stirrings of certainty. The truth was here in St. Aldhelm's Rest, she thought. All one had to do was look closely enough to see it hiding in plain sight. The next morning dawned pale and unsettled, the kind of grey light that seems to hold its breath before a storm. St. Aldhelm's Rest was quieter than usual. Even the sparrows seemed subdued. Yet beneath that silence lay a restless energy, the hum of speculation and fear that grips small places when something unspeakable intrudes upon their order. Miss Marple rose early, as was her habit, and took breakfast with Mrs. West. Over marmalade and toast, the conversation inevitably turned toward the tragedy at the Laurels. Mrs. West was still shaken, though she tried to maintain her usual good humor. "The poor man," she sighed, "and such a polite one, too. I keep wondering who this Clara was, the one he wrote to. It must have been someone dear, to be writing on the very night of his death." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. "Yes, my dear Caroline, affection, remorse, guilt, letters to loved ones are often written with one or another of those sentiments, sometimes all at once. But what's most telling is that the letter was unfinished. That usually means interruption, something unexpected." Mrs. West frowned. "You think someone came into the room?" "Perhaps. Or perhaps he realized something. A man may stop mid-sentence not only because someone knocks on his door, but because a sudden thought strikes him. Something dreadful or enlightening." The sound of carriage wheels outside made them both glance toward the window. Inspector Finch was making his morning rounds. He dismounted stiffly and went into the vicarage to consult the Reverend. Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but she murmured, almost to herself, "I wonder if he's found that missing notebook." She learned soon enough that he had not. By noon, word had spread that the police were no closer to a conclusion. The toxicologist's early report confirmed that Mr. Harcourt had died from a concentrated dose of digitalis, common enough in village gardens, but rare in deliberate use. Finch suspected either accident or suicide. The villagers, murder. Miss Marple, however, entertained neither theory fully. Suicide, to her mind, required a kind of preparation, tidying one's affairs, leaving notes, small, careful gestures. Yet Mr. Harcourt had unpacked only half his belongings. His shaving kit remained unopened, his coat still folded in the trunk. That did not speak of a man intending to die. She decided to pay a second visit to the Laurels. The constable on duty at the gate recognized her immediately. In such places, everyone knew Miss Marple by sight and reputation. She was permitted into the garden on the pretext of calling on Mrs. Burnham, who still looked pale and sleepless. The older woman was grateful for the company, though her nerves twitched at every creak of the house. "They say it's poison," she whispered. "But how could it be?" I brew my tea the same way every day. I even keep the tins labeled Ceylon, Darjeeling, and the herbal blend for the vicar's wife. None of them would hurt a soul." Miss Marple's eyes rested gently on the tea caddy on the sideboard. "Yes, but Mr. Harcourt had his own, didn't he? The little black tin he brought from London." Mrs. Burnham blinked. "That's true, now that you mention it. Said he liked his tea strong, like a city man should, he told me. But when the police searched, they didn't find any such tin." "Ah," Miss Marple said softly. "Then we may safely assume someone else did." The two women sat in silence for a moment, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock on the mantel. Miss Marple's gaze wandered about the room, the polished sideboard, the framed photographs, the faint outline of dust disturbed on a writing table. She noticed, almost idly, that one of the drawers had been hastily closed, the edge of a lace handkerchief caught in it. "May I?" she asked politely. Mrs. Burnham nodded, puzzled. Inside the drawer lay a folded scrap of paper. It was nothing remarkable at first glance, just a torn envelope. But the handwriting on it made Miss Marple's eyes sharpen. The ink was the same as on the unfinished letter found in Harcourt's room, though the words here were few and cryptic. "Meet me by the yew at dusk." "That wasn't here before," Mrs. Burnham said nervously. "At least, I don't think it was." "No," Miss Marple murmured. "I dare say it wasn't." She folded the scrap neatly and handed it to the constable, who had followed them inside. He looked blankly at it. "Yew tree? There's a row of them by the churchyard." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, rising. "And one of them hides a bench, quite secluded. I remember it well." The inspector arrived just as she was stepping out into the garden. He greeted her with polite skepticism. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple. I hope you're not conducting your own inquiry." "Oh, dear me, no," she said, smiling sweetly. "I merely observe. I've always found it quite extraordinary what one can learn by looking where others don't." He grunted, non-committal, and turned back toward the house. Miss Marple continued down the garden path, her eyes sweeping over the gravel, the flower beds, the faint marks where boots had disturbed the soil. She paused near the gate, crouched slightly, and brushed her fingers against the ground. There, half buried in the earth, gleamed something small and metallic. A cufflink, engraved with the initials C.W. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on it, then drifted up toward the distant spire of the church, where a cluster of yews cast long, dark shadows in the fading light. She tucked the cufflink discreetly into her glove. As she walked back to the vicarage, she reflected quietly. Mr. Harcourt had not been alone that night. Whoever had met him by the yew had also taken his notebook, and perhaps much more. The question was not merely who poisoned him, but what secret had followed him from London to this quiet little village, where every friendly smile now concealed a question, and every word might be a lie. That evening, the mist that had crept across the village the previous night returned heavier and thicker, muffling sound and softening the glow of every lamp. Inside Mrs. West's cozy sitting room, the air smelled faintly of lavender polish and pipe tobacco. Miss Marple sat near the hearth, her knitting untouched on her lap, lost in quiet contemplation. The cufflink rested in her gloved palm, polished, elegant, and distinctly masculine. The initials C.W. caught the flickering light of the fire. She knew only one man in St. Aldhelm's Rest whose initials matched. Charles Winchcombe, the vicar's nephew, a well-liked but rather indolent young fellow who had returned from London only a month ago under somewhat vague circumstances. He had the charm of the careless and the smile of a man used to smoothing over inconvenient questions. Miss Marple had met many such men in her time, and she knew better than most that charm often grew best in soil rich with deceit. When the clock struck 8, the doorbell rang, and the Reverend Copley entered, his face a portrait of troubled dignity. "Jane," he began awkwardly, addressing her with the gentle familiarity reserved for those whom everyone trusted, "I do wish you'd speak to young Charles. The inspector has been asking him questions." He's dreadfully upset. Says he's being made a scapegoat for that poor fellow's death." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "Oh dear. And does he say why the inspector might think so?" "Well, apparently Charles was seen near the churchyard on the night in question, around dusk." The Reverend's expression darkened. He admits it freely. "Says he was walking for air, poor lad. You know what these small minds are like? They'll make gossip out of anything." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, gossip has an uncanny way of circling the truth, though it rarely touches it directly." She rose, taking her shawl from the back of the chair. "Perhaps I should have a little word with him myself." She found Charles in the vicarage study, pacing before the cold fireplace, his youthful confidence fraying at the edges. He started slightly when she entered. "Miss Marple, I hope you don't think, well, that is, I've nothing to do with any of this horrid business." "I'm quite sure you don't wish to," she said kindly, "but one's wishes and one's circumstances are sometimes at odds." She gestured for him to sit. "I understand you were out that evening, by the churchyard." He hesitated. "Yes, it was close and heavy indoors. I took a walk toward the yews. Needed to clear my head." "Quite understandable," she said, settling herself opposite him. "Did you meet anyone there?" "No, certainly not." His tone came too quickly, too firmly. Then after a pause, "At least, I might have heard voices further off. I didn't linger." Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes as mild as a dove's, but sharp as a needle. "And you dropped a cufflink, perhaps?" He froze. "A cufflink? Good heavens! Have you found one?" She smiled. "One sometimes notices little things, like a shiny object in the earth near the yews." For a moment he said nothing. Then he exhaled and laughed nervously. "I must have lost it weeks ago. I wore that pair to the fete committee meeting, I think. They've been missing since." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured. "Well, that does seem quite possible." She rose, adjusting her shawl. One should never underestimate how things misplaced have a tendency to turn up again at precisely the most awkward time. She left him pale and restless, staring into the cold hearth. Outside, the mist had thickened. The lamps on the lane glowed like blurred halos in the damp air. Miss Marple walked slowly toward the laurels once more, her thoughts weaving together like the threads of a pattern on her needles. She had no proof yet, only impressions, but impressions, properly arranged, often revealed more than any confession. Mrs. Burnham met her at the door again, her face drawn. "Oh, Miss Marple, such a terrible business. The inspector says the poison was in the sugar bowl, but I never... Calm yourself, my dear," Miss Marple said soothingly. "I'm sure you didn't. Tell me, how many people had access to that tea tray before it went up?" "Just me and Elsie, the maid. I prepared the pot, the cup, and the sugar bowl. Then I called Elsie to take it up. She carried it straight away, no more than a minute's delay." Miss Marple nodded, thinking. "And did Mr. Harcourt ever have visitors? Anyone who called on him here?" "None that I saw," Mrs. Burnham said, twisting her apron. "Though once, yes, now that you mention it, there was a knock late one evening. I heard voices in the hall. He said it was someone about a business matter. A lady, I think." "A lady?" "Yes, though I didn't see her face. She wore a dark hat and veil. It was only for a few minutes, and then she was gone." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "My dear Mrs. Burnham, I believe you've just told me something very important indeed." She returned to the vicarage deep in thought. There was now a shape forming out of the mist of rumor and conjecture. A man who brought his own tea-tin, a missing notebook, a letter to someone named Clara, a meeting by the yews, a vanished woman in black, and a cufflink belonging to a young man who swore he'd seen no one. It was, Miss Marple reflected, quite like human nature itself, tidy on the surface, but underneath, a tangle of half-truth, vanity, and fear. And somewhere in that tangle, One very dangerous person was waiting, quietly confident that no one had seen the pattern they'd woven. But Miss Marple had seen it. Not yet clearly, perhaps, but enough to know that soon the threads would draw tight. The following day brought a watery sort of sunshine, glinting through thinning mist and falling on the cobblestones like pale glass. It did little to brighten the spirits of St. Aldhelm's Rest. The talk in the village square had turned sharper now, more accusatory. The name Winchcombe was being whispered in corners, with a kind of nervous relish small communities reserve for other people's troubles. The vicar's wife had taken to defending her nephew with fierce propriety, which only fueled the speculation further. Miss Marple, meanwhile, went about her morning errands as though nothing were amiss, visiting the grocer, exchanging pleasantries with the postmistress, and finally stopping at the churchyard, where the yews stood solemn and still in the damp earth. She traced the path leading from the gate to the shaded bench, noting how the gravel had been freshly disturbed into patches. Someone, she thought, had been here quite recently, perhaps to look or to hide something. She leaned down and brushed away a few leaves. Beneath them was a crumpled piece of paper, half soaked by dew. Carefully, she smoothed it open. It was a page torn from a notebook. Mr. Harcourt's, she was certain. The handwriting matched the letter found on his desk, but the words were different. Must settle matters before she arrives. I cannot keep both promises. C.W. suspects. Miss Marple folded the paper neatly into her handkerchief and slipped it into her bag, her mind already working through the implications. So, Charles Winchcombe had been mentioned by Harcourt himself, and in the context of suspicion. That changed the shape of things considerably. As she left the churchyard, she nearly collided with Inspector Finch, who was coming up the lane. "Miss Marple," he said gruffly, though not unkindly, "I've a notion you're about to tell me something." "Only, my dear Inspector," she said, smiling, "that it seems to me the late Mr. Harcourt's affairs were not quite as solitary as they appeared. I wonder, did you happen to find any correspondence from a lady among his belongings?" He frowned. "No letters except that half-written one, but we did trace a wire he sent from Melchester 2 days before his death to a Mrs. Clara Wentworth. No address, just a forwarding service in London. We're still chasing it." "Clara Wentworth," Miss Marple repeated softly. "C.W. again." The inspector blinked. "Good heavens, you think—" "I think," she interrupted gently, "that sometimes initials can belong to more than one person. It's rather like a game of musical chairs. Only one seat, but several eager to claim it." Finch looked puzzled, but Miss Marple was already walking away. Her eyes had that distant brightness they took on when she was quietly assembling her conclusions. That afternoon, she made another unobtrusive call, this time to the vicarage, where Charles was once more pacing the study, visibly frayed. He started when she entered. "I suppose the inspectors told you they've found something else to hold against me?" "Oh, no," she said pleasantly, seating herself by the window. "In fact, I've come because I find myself rather interested in coincidences." "Coincidences?" he repeated, bewildered. "Yes. It's a funny thing, but coincidences are almost never accidental. For instance, 2 people sharing the same initials, or both having reason to meet the same man under different pretenses." She watched his color drain slightly. "You see, Mr. Harcourt wrote your initials in a note shortly before he died. But I wonder, was he referring to you, or to Mrs. Clara Wentworth?" He said nothing, his jaw tightening. "I imagine," she continued mildly, "that you might have known her too. She lived in London once, didn't she? Before her husband's rather mysterious disappearance?" Charles swallowed hard. "I didn't. Well, that is, I met her once or twice. Society things. But I didn't know she knew Harcourt." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Oh, but you see, she did. Quite well, I should think. He came here expecting her, or so Mrs. Burnham says. A lady in black called on him the night before he died. He must have believed she'd come from London. I dare say he told her too much. His eyes widened. You think she— Miss Marple rose and smiled. My dear boy, I think it's best not to think too quickly. The truth has a dreadful way of slipping past those who rush to meet it. But I would advise you to stay in tonight, and not, under any circumstances, to trust anyone who knocks on the door after dark. That evening, the rain began. A thin, persistent drizzle that darkened the village roofs and made the lamplight shimmer on the puddled cobblestones. Miss Marple sat once more by the fire in Mrs. West's parlour, her knitting needles moving rhythmically, though her mind was far from her work. At 9:30, a sound broke through the steady rain, the clatter of hooves on the lane, then a sudden sharp cry. Miss Marple rose immediately, moving to the window. A constable was hurrying up the vicarage path, lantern swinging. Within minutes, the calm of the village had shattered once again. Charles Winchcombe had been found in the churchyard, struck from behind near the yews. Not dead, thank heavens, but badly injured and unconscious. Miss Marple arrived moments later, shawl pulled tight against the rain, and gazed down at the young man's pale face as the constable explained. Found him lying just where the Harcourt chap met his end. Looks like someone tried to finish the job. She nodded slowly. Yes, she said softly, and failed, though perhaps not by accident. The person who did this wanted to frighten him, not kill him. They wanted him silent. Her gaze drifted to the shadows beneath the yews, where the mist hung heavy and still. Somewhere out there, she thought, the same mind that had brewed Mr. Harcourt's fatal cup of tea was now growing desperate. And desperation, she knew from long experience, was when even the cleverest murderer began to make mistakes. Through the long, damp hours that followed, the village seemed to hold its breath. The rain had settled into a steady patter, and every sound, the drip from the eaves, the distant toll of the church bell, felt unnaturally loud. Miss Marple remained at the vicarage as the doctor tended to Charles. He had regained consciousness briefly, murmuring fragments of phrases. "The you," she said. "It wasn't meant," before slipping back into uneasy sleep. The doctor could make little sense of it, but Miss Marple, seated quietly in a corner, heard every word with grave attention. When the inspector returned, wet and irritable, she met him in the hall. "He'll live," she said softly, "though I'm afraid his troubles are far from over." Finch sighed, rubbing his brow. "It looks like someone struck him with a blunt instrument. Could have been robbery. He had his watch on him, but the pocketbook was missing." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured, "a missing pocketbook and a missing notebook. One might almost think the same person has a fondness for collecting Mr. Harcourt's belongings." The inspector frowned. "You think this attack's connected?" "My dear inspector, in my experience, there are no isolated acts of violence in a quiet place like this. Evil travels like ivy. It clings and spreads, covering more ground than one expects." She leaned slightly closer. "Tell me, did you find anything near where he was attacked?" "Only his lantern and some footprints. A woman's, maybe. Hard to tell in the mud." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Then I dare say you should speak to Mrs. Burnham's maid, Elsie. She's been out after dark more than once lately, though she claims she's frightened of her own shadow." Finch raised an eyebrow. "You think the maid's involved?" "I think," said Miss Marple mildly, "that frightened girls sometimes do foolish things for the wrong people." The inspector departed to follow her advice, while Miss Marple remained a moment longer at the window, watching the dark garden beyond the glass. Somewhere in that gloom she knew was the key, someone whose motives had been born not out of greed or madness, but fear. Fear was always at the root of such things. Later that evening, she visited Mrs. Burnham once more. The poor woman was near tears, distraught over the violence that seemed to follow her once happy home. "It's cursed, Miss Marple," she whispered. "First the gentleman dies, and now this. I can't bear it. And Elsie, well, she's taken ill suddenly. Shut herself in her room, saying she's sick to her stomach." "Has she now?" Miss Marple said quietly. "Perhaps I might have a little word with her." The maid's room was small and close, smelling of damp linen. Elsie sat on the bed, pale and trembling, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. When Miss Marple entered, she looked up with wide, frightened eyes. "Oh, miss, I don't know anything. Truly I don't," she began, before Miss Marple had spoken a word. "Now, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly, taking a seat beside her, "you mustn't upset yourself. No one's blaming you, but I should like to know who it was you met by the yews last night." Elsie gasped, clutching the edge of her shawl. I only went because she said she needed to talk. Said it was about Mr. Harcourt, and she'd make it worth my while." "She," Miss Marple repeated softly. "Would that be the lady in black Mrs. Burnham mentioned?" The girl nodded miserably. "She told me not to tell anyone she'd been to the Laurels. Said she was his wife, but I don't think that was true. She gave me money to fetch something from his room, a little notebook he'd left on the desk. She said it was hers, that he'd taken it from her." "And did you fetch it?" "I tried, miss. Truly I did, but I got scared when I heard footsteps on the stairs. I dropped it in the garden. I think she found it later." Her voice broke. "Oh, miss, I didn't mean any harm. She said no one would get hurt." Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on her arm. "You poor child. People who mean harm rarely announce it in advance." After calming the girl, Miss Marple left quietly, her expression grave. She walked home through the mist, her umbrella barely, shielding her from the fine, persistent drizzle. The picture was becoming clearer now. Harcourt had been meeting a woman connected to his past. Clara Wentworth, if she was indeed the lady in black. Whatever secrets lay in that notebook were dangerous enough to drive someone to kill for them. When Miss Marple reached Mrs. West's gate, the inspector was waiting for her, looking perplexed and slightly embarrassed. "You were right about the maid," he said. "She's admitted to being bribed. And we've just had word from London. Clara Wentworth was Mr. Harcourt's former fiancée. She married another man, one who died suddenly 2 years ago. Harcourt accused her of foul play, apparently, and the police dismissed it." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed faintly in the lantern light. "Ah, so she had every reason to dislike him, and every reason to silence him if he meant to speak again. Yes, Inspector, I think we are getting very close indeed." The inspector nodded grimly. "Then I'll send a man to the station in the morning. We'll have her description circulated." Miss Marple shook her head. "No, my dear man. You won't have to look far. If I'm not mistaken, she's already here." And as she turned her gaze toward the darkened windows of the Laurels, a shadow moved briefly against the upstairs curtain. Swift, deliberate, and unmistakably feminine. Miss Marple's voice dropped to a whisper. "The lady in black never left." Miss Marple waited until the inspector's footsteps faded down the lane before moving. She crossed the street with quiet precision, her shawl drawn close and her umbrella hooked on her arm. The rain had softened to a mist now, clinging to her silver hair and giving the night a strange clarity. The Laurels loomed ahead, its upper window faintly glowing. Someone was awake. She knocked softly. After a long pause, the door creaked open. Mrs. Burnham stood there, pale and nervous. "Oh, Miss Marple, you startled me. I thought, well, never mind. Do come in." "Thank you, my dear," Miss Marple said with her customary gentleness, stepping inside. "I was merely passing and thought I might see how you were bearing up." The house was dimly lit, the smell of damp roses drifting faintly through the open window. Miss Marple's sharp eyes noticed a small trunk by the stairs, an unfamiliar one, of dark leather with a worn brass clasp. It was half hidden under a shawl, but not well enough. "How thoughtful of you to visit," Mrs. Burnham said, twisting her hands in her apron. "I'm afraid I'm quite beside myself. The constable was here earlier asking questions about the lady who came that evening. I told him all I knew, which isn't much." Miss Marple gave a mild smile. "You've been very helpful, I'm sure. I wonder, though, did you ever happen to see her face, even briefly?" Mrs. Burnham hesitated. Only for a second. She was fair, I think. Or perhaps the light played tricks, I can't be sure. Ah, Miss Marple murmured. And yet you kept her secret well enough. You didn't mention the trunk she brought. The woman stiffened. Trunk, she stammered. Oh, that old thing. It's not hers, it's mine. Miss Marple's eyes were gentle but unwavering. My dear, I'm afraid it isn't. I happened to notice the initials on the clasp. C.W. I should say that trunk belonged to the lady herself, and now, I believe, to you. For a moment, Mrs. Burnham said nothing. Her lips trembled, her eyes darting toward the staircase as though expecting someone to descend. Then, quietly, she whispered, You know, don't you? I know enough, Miss Marple said softly. She's here, isn't she? Clara Wentworth. She never left after she came that night. A sound from upstairs, light footsteps, then the faint rustle of fabric. Mrs. Burnham closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. She came to me desperate, she said in a broken whisper. Said she'd done nothing wrong, that Mr. Harcourt meant to ruin her life. She begged for one night's shelter. I didn't think it would come to this. Oh, God help me, I didn't. Miss Marple laid a comforting hand on her arm. Hush now. You've been very brave, Mrs. Burnham, but you must let the inspector know where she is. If you don't, worse things will follow. Before the woman could reply, a voice came from the landing, cool, weary, and unmistakably composed. That won't be necessary. Clara Wentworth stood there in the dim light, dressed in mourning black, her veil pushed back to reveal a face of striking beauty, though hollowed by sleeplessness. Her gloved hands rested lightly on the banister. So, she said evenly, the famous Miss Marple. I should have guessed it would be you stirring the quiet. Miss Marple inclined her head. I assure you, Mrs. Wentworth, it was already quite stirred before I arrived. Clara's lips twitched faintly, somewhere between amusement and exhaustion. I didn't kill him, she said after a moment. Whatever he wrote, whatever lies he spread, it wasn't me. He poisoned himself. He was dying already. He told me as much. Heart trouble, he said. He wanted to make it look like I'd done it. One last bit of cruelty. Poisoned himself? Miss Marple said gently. With digitalis from his own tea tin, perhaps. Clara's composure faltered, only slightly. Yes, he always brought his own. He was paranoid. I thought if I left before anyone saw me. But someone did, Miss Marple said softly. A frightened maid who mistook loyalty for kindness. And then, when Mr. Winchcombe grew suspicious, someone attacked him too, perhaps to make certain he wouldn't speak of what he'd seen. Clara's hands clenched around the rail. I didn't touch that boy. I only wanted my notebook back. It contained letters from years ago. He'd kept them all. He said they were insurance in case I forgot what I owed him. And now it's missing again, Miss Marple said. You see, Mrs. Wentworth, lies have a way of tangling themselves around the truth. I believe you didn't pour that poison, but I do think you were here when he died. And that's a secret that never stays buried for long. The woman's breath hitched, then steadied. Perhaps you're right, but if I go to the police, they'll never believe me. They'll say I came here to finish what I began in London. Miss Marple's eyes softened. Then let me tell them. I have a talent for making sense of untidy stories. Outside, a faint glow spread across the horizon, the first hint of dawn through the mist. Clara Wentworth looked toward it as though seeing an end to something long and terrible. Slowly, she descended the stairs, her gloved hand brushing the rail. You're an extraordinary woman, she said quietly. I almost wish we'd met before my life went to ruin. Miss Marple gave a small, wistful smile. Oh, my dear, I've known many women who thought their lives were ruined. Most of them were simply standing at the wrong end of the story. By the time Inspector Finch arrived, Clara had confessed enough to clear away the worst of the lies. But as Miss Marple watched her being led away through the grey morning, She knew one piece still didn't fit, the notebook. Someone else had taken it, and not for sentiment. Someone who had been very near indeed when the tea was poured, and Miss Marple intended to find out who. By the following afternoon, the rain had ceased and the village emerged from its uneasy silence. The sun broke weakly through the clouds, though it seemed to do little to warm the chill that had settled over St. Aldhelm's Rest. Clara Wentworth's arrest had stirred as much pity as relief. Some swore she was guilty, others whispered of tragic romance and betrayal. But beneath the talk there lingered a restlessness, a sense that the business was not yet finished. Miss Marple felt it too. She sat in Mrs. West's drawing-room, knitting forgotten in her lap, eyes fixed on the pale light streaming through the lace curtains. Inspector Finch had been and gone, smug in the way men are when they believe a case tied up neatly. Yet to Miss Marple, the neatness was precisely what troubled her. It fit too well, too conveniently, like a story shaped to satisfy, rather than to explain. Clara Wentworth might have had motive and opportunity, but not the temperament for precision. The digitalis had been measured exactly, not a hurried act, but a deliberate one. Mrs. West entered, bustling as always, holding the latest gossip like a tray of warm scones. "The inspector says it's all settled, Jane. Apparently the woman confessed enough to hang herself, though he did mention that missing notebook still hasn't been found. Likely destroyed, I should think." Miss Marple looked up, mildly. "Destroyed, my dear Caroline. Or concealed. There's a vast difference between the two. Burning evidence is an act of panic. Hiding it is an act of calculation, and I'm afraid our murderer was quite a calculating sort." Mrs. West blinked. "You mean you don't think Mrs. Wentworth—" "No," said Miss Marple softly. "I think she was a frightened woman caught in another's web, but there's still someone here in St. Aldhelm's Rest who knows precisely where that notebook is and what it contains." She rose then, her movement slow but deliberate. "Would you be so kind as to send for young Charles? I believe it's time he and I had one last talk." Within the hour, Charles Winchcombe arrived, pale and subdued, a bandage still visible beneath his collar. He greeted Miss Marple with nervous gratitude. "I owe you my life, Miss Marple. If you hadn't warned me that night, well, I might not be here." She smiled faintly. "You owe me nothing, my dear. But I do hope you'll forgive an old woman's curiosity. You see, there's something I still don't quite understand. You claimed you'd never met Mrs. Wentworth before, and yet Mr. Harcourt's letter suggested you knew more than you admitted. Why was that, I wonder?" Charles hesitated, his gaze dropping. I knew of her, of course. London society, that sort of thing. But I didn't want to say. You can't imagine what it's like being accused of—" "Oh, I can imagine a great many things," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "But perhaps you can help me with a smaller one. Where were you the morning after Mr. Harcourt's death?" He blinked, surprised by the sudden shift. "At the inn, mostly. I'd gone there early, before the police arrived. Needed air and a drink to steady myself." "Indeed," she said. "And yet the innkeeper tells me no one saw you there until after 11. Curious, isn't it? Between 8 and 11, then, you were somewhere else." "Perhaps retrieving something from the Laurel's garden." Charles's jaw tightened. "You've no proof of that?" Miss Marple's voice softened, almost kind. "No, but I don't need proof, only understanding. You see, it was you who took the notebook from Harcourt's desk that night. You followed the maid when she dropped it, didn't you? You realized what it was. The record of Harcourt's schemes, his blackmail notes, the debts he held over several London names. Including your own, I dare say." He went very still. "He ruined me," he said at last, low and trembling. "I was young and stupid. I signed things I shouldn't have. He was going to publish it all, expose everyone. Clara, too. She begged me to reason with him, said she couldn't bear another scandal." "So you reasoned with him?" Miss Marple said softly. "Over tea." He looked up, stricken. "I didn't mean to kill him, only to frighten him. just enough to make him burn the papers, but he drank too soon. I'd barely left the tray when I heard him fall. And then she arrived. I panicked. Miss Marple sighed, her expression gentle but grave. Oh, my dear boy, you made a terrible mess of things trying to clean one. That's the tragedy of it, you see. Evil's never neat. It sticks. It spreads. And now an innocent woman sits accused because you lacked the courage to tell the truth. He buried his face in his hands. What will happen to her? That, she said, depends on what you choose to do next. If you tell the inspector the truth tonight, perhaps she'll see daylight again. If not, well, justice has its own way of finding those who hide from it. For a long moment, the only sound was the steady ticking of the mantel clock. Then Charles rose, shoulders bowed, and left without another word. When the door closed behind him, Miss Marple resumed her knitting with quiet precision. Mrs. West appeared in the doorway, eyes wide. Jane, do you really think he'll confess? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Oh, I shouldn't wonder. He's not wicked, only weak. And weakness, my dear Caroline, is what most wickedness is built upon. Outside, the church bell tolled the hour. Somewhere in the distance, a carriage door slammed, and Miss Marple knew the inspector would soon be receiving a visitor with shaking hands and a burdened heart. The truth, as always, had come creeping out in its own time, quietly, inevitably, and just as the dawn began to break. The evening that followed was one of uneasy quiet. St. Aldhelm's Rest had the strange stillness of a village holding its breath, aware that something had shifted beneath its tranquil surface. The news of Charles Winchcombe's visit to the inspector had not yet spread, but rumor has a way of sensing the truth before it is spoken. Lamps burned late in the vicarage, and Miss Marple, sitting by her window with her knitting, could see the faint silhouette of the young man pacing in the study below. He had not left for Melchester yet, though she knew he would. Guilt, she thought, has a curious way of delaying courage. It never rushes toward its reckoning, only drifts there, unwilling and heavy. The night deepened, the rain gone, but the ground still glistening with its memory. Miss Marple's eyes grew thoughtful as she watched the light from the vicarage flicker and fade. When at last the house went dark, she allowed herself a small sigh. She had lived long enough to recognize that a confession, even a sincere one, rarely brings peace at once. It unsettles, it bruises, but in the end, it is the only thing that can heal. Morning came crisp and clear for the first time in days. A thrush was singing on the garden wall when Mrs. West burst into the breakfast room, her cap askew and excitement in her voice. Jane, you'll never believe it. Inspector Finch has just been by. Charles went to the station in the night and turned himself in. He told the whole story, how he'd tried to frighten Mr. Harcourt, and how the woman in black came after. They've telegraphed Melchester already. Mrs. Wentworth's to be released at once. Miss Marple set down her cup gently. I'm very glad to hear it, Caroline. The poor woman has suffered enough, though I fear this will haunt her still. And as for Charles, well, he will have to learn that mistakes born of cowardice often cost more than crimes born of malice. Mrs. West sighed. It's dreadful, all of it. And to think it began with nothing more than a guest house and a pot of tea. Ah, said Miss Marple, her eyes softening. Tea has been the undoing of many people. It has a way of drawing out truth, perhaps because people feel safest when holding a cup. She smiled faintly. Even murderers. That afternoon, the inspector called on her personally. He was more subdued than usual, the stiffness in his voice replaced by something like respect. Well, Miss Marple, it seems your instincts were right again. Winchcombe confessed to everything. We found the notebook buried near the yews, wrapped in oilcloth exactly where you said to look. Contains evidence of blackmail, all sorts of nasty business. The Crown'll handle the rest, I suppose. You've done us quite the service. Miss Marple gave a modest smile. I only noticed what was already there, Inspector. People are really quite simple, you know. They act out their fears more plainly than they imagine. The trick is merely to see them as they are, not as they wish to appear." He grunted. "Wish I had your eyes for it." Then, after a pause, "Funny thing, though. Harcourt's letter, the one to Clara, ended with the words, 'You'll forgive me when it's done.' He knew something, I think. Maybe even planned to die." Miss Marple's expression grew distant. "Perhaps. There are those who arrange their own deaths just as carefully as their lives, only they forget the mess they leave behind for others to tidy. I dare say Harcourt's death was half accident, half design. He meant to torment one last soul before the end. It's a cruel way to make peace." The inspector tipped his hat, still looking troubled. "You make it sound as though justice and cruelty often shake hands." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. "Oh, they do, Inspector. In villages, in cities. It's all the same. The only difference is that in villages, everyone pretends not to notice." He left her then, his heavy boots fading down the lane. The day brightened slowly. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, laying soft gold across the parlor floor. Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her thoughts drifting. The case, she knew, would fade soon enough, become another story retold at garden teas, reduced to rumor and moral. Yet for her, the lesson was always the same. Evil rarely enters a room loudly. It comes in quietly, like a guest who never meant to stay, and before long it has made itself at ease. Home. By the week's end, life in St. Aldhelm's Rest resumed its gentle rhythm. The villagers spoke of the incident in lowered tones, each insisting they'd always suspected something. Mrs. Burnham reopened the laurels, though she never again served tea without a visible tremor of the hand. The Reverend preached a sermon on redemption, and Mrs. West decided rather suddenly that she might visit her sister in Bath for a change of air. As for Miss Marple, she spent her evenings once more by the fire, her needles glinting as she worked, her mind as tranquil as the ticking clock beside her. Yet when the post arrived one morning, a single envelope addressed in an unfamiliar hand, she paused before opening it. Inside lay only a brief note, unsigned in careful, looping script. "For what it's worth, I never meant for him to die. Thank you for seeing what others could not." She folded it quietly, a faint, wistful smile touching her lips. Then she tucked it into her knitting basket, beside the half-finished scarf she would never quite complete. Outside, the village bell chimed noon, and life in St. Aldhelm's Rest went on, peaceful as ever, though Miss Marple, looking out at the quiet street, knew peace was only ever a delicate illusion. And somewhere, in that fragile calm, human nature waited, soft-spoken, polite, and forever capable of the most extraordinary mischief. A few quiet weeks passed in St. Aldhelm's Rest, and the village began to heal in its quiet, deliberate way. The laurels once again smelled faintly of polish and lavender. The postmistress had found new gossip to replace the old, and even the vicar's sermons had shifted from repentance to gratitude. But for Miss Marple, whose eyes missed little and forgot even less, the case was not so neatly folded away. There was something in the margins still unsettled, like a thread left untied in a well-sewn garment. She thought of the letter she had received, the anonymous note of regret written in that careful, elegant hand. The more she looked at it, the more it puzzled her. It had not been written by Charles Winchcombe. His handwriting was angular and hurried. Nor was it from Clara Wentworth, whose fine, slanted script the inspector had shown her in the course of the inquiry. No, this was someone else entirely, someone who had known enough to thank her and enough to remain unseen. That evening, Miss Marple invited Mrs. Burnham to tea. The poor woman had been through much, but her composure had begun to return, and she seemed grateful for the normalcy. As they sat by the fire, Miss Marple poured out the tea herself, Darjeeling this time without the faintest trace of irony. "My dear Mrs. Burnham," she began gently, "you must be relieved that things have been settled at last. Such dreadful business for a quiet house." Mrs. Burnham smiled wanly. Relieved, yes, but I confess, I still think of him, Mr. Harcourt, the way he looked that night. It doesn't leave one's mind easily. I dare say not, Miss Marple said softly. You were fond of him, perhaps? The woman hesitated, her spoon clinking softly against the cup. Fond is too strong a word, Miss Marple, but he was interesting, polite when he wished to be, and lonely, I think. Lonely people can be very dangerous, Miss Marple murmured. They inspire sympathy when what they most deserve is caution. Mrs. Burnham's hand stilled. You think he deceived me? I think he deceived everyone, Miss Marple said quietly. But I also think someone here deceived themselves. You see, I received a note after the matter was concluded, unsigned but written in a hand I'd seen before. A tidy hand, used to ledgers and correspondence. It struck me that whoever wrote it knew the truth not as the police recorded it, but as it truly was. The color drained slowly from Mrs. Burnham's face. I don't understand. Oh, I believe you do, Miss Marple said kindly, not unkindly. You see, when I first entered the Laurels that dreadful morning, I noticed something quite small, too small for the inspector to care about. A cup overturned beside the body and another still on the tray, quite untouched. You told me it was his tea tray, but I've lived long enough in villages to know that good hostesses, even the most proper, often share a cup when a guest seems troubled, especially one they find interesting. Mrs. Burnham's lips parted soundlessly. Miss Marple continued gently. You meant no harm. You brewed the tea as you always did. Only he asked for the sugar bowl himself, didn't he? He was a careful man, but that evening his hands shook. He spilled a little, and you, thinking nothing of it, poured your own cup from the same pot. Only you didn't die because the poison was in the sugar. His sugar. You hadn't taken any. He had. Tears welled in Mrs. Burnham's eyes. Then why did you think it was me? I didn't, Miss Marple said simply. But I wondered who else knew. You told the inspector you hadn't gone near the body before they arrived. And yet when I returned the next day, I saw you wiping the desk drawer, the one where his papers had been. A natural instinct, perhaps, but when the notebook vanished, it was clear someone had acted after the fact. You said it was for decency, to make the room tidy. But really, my dear, you were frightened someone might read what he'd written about you. Mrs. Burnham's breath caught in her throat. I didn't kill him. No, Miss Marple said softly. He killed himself, though not without cruelty. But afterward, you hid the notebook to protect your good name, and perhaps to protect others. You knew what it contained, the debts, the letters, the favors owed by respectable people. You wanted to spare the village a scandal. Mrs. Burnham lowered her head, trembling. He said he would ruin me, that people would talk, that I'd be called his mistress. I couldn't let that happen, Miss Marple. You know what they're like here, how they whisper. I only wanted to make it go away. And so you sent me that note, Miss Marple said, her voice as gentle as the ticking clock, to thank me for seeing what the world mustn't. It was a kind impulse, if a foolish one. But take my advice, dear. You must tell the inspector where you buried the notebook. Secrets have a dreadful way of festering, and you've carried this one long enough. Mrs. Burnham wept quietly, the sound small and tired, like rain against glass. Miss Marple rose and placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. It will be all right, my dear. People will forgive more than you think. They always do, once the truth is told softly enough. When Mrs. Burnham left, Miss Marple sat alone by the dying fire, her teacup cooling beside her. She felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only that familiar melancholy that came at the end of such matters. The law would see to the rest, though she doubted there would be much appetite for punishment. After all, no one in St. Aldhelm's Rest truly wanted the story reopened. Outside, the village bell chimed 7, its sound carrying softly through the evening air. The light beyond the window was fading, and the street lay peaceful once more, as though the world had forgotten the death, the deceit, and all that had followed. Miss Marple looked out into that calm, her expression unreadable. "Human nature," she whispered to herself, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "It never does change, only the names." And with that, she lifted her knitting once more, the needles clicking softly as night settled over the village, each stitch neat, deliberate, and unerringly precise, like the truth itself. The following morning dawned clear and golden, the kind of soft English sunlight that makes even the gravestones in the churchyard seem almost benevolent. St. Aldhelm's Rest, at last, appeared to have found its peace again. The laurels, though quieter than before, stood freshly scrubbed, the roses trimmed, the curtains washed. The village, having exhausted its appetite for gossip, had returned to its usual rhythm, though a faint echo of the affair lingered in every polite pause, every cautious glance. Miss Marple sat in the vicarage garden, a cup of tea beside her, and her knitting resting loosely in her lap. She was alone, save for the soft hum of bees around the late roses. The inspector had called earlier, looking somewhat sheepish as he reported that Mrs. Burnham's confession to concealing the notebook would result in little more than public reprimand. "Couldn't bring myself to press it further," he'd said, almost apologetically. "She's suffered enough. And between you and me, Miss Marple, she's not the only one in this village who's been keeping up appearances." Miss Marple had only smiled, for she understood very well the delicate fabric of such communities, woven from kindness, secrecy, and the fragile comfort of pretending certain things never happened. Now, as she sat in the quiet garden, she reflected on the curious way it had all unfolded. A lonely man's cruelty, a frightened woman's silence, a young man's guilt. 3 lives intertwined in deceit, yet none truly wicked, merely human. Mrs. West soon joined her, bearing a tray of scones and a look of deep relief. "Well, Jane, it's all over at last," she said with a sigh, sitting down beside her. "I can't tell you what a comfort it is to have the matter behind us. I was half afraid the laurels would be shuttered forever. Mrs. Burnham's to leave for her sisters in Dorset next week, you know. Starting anew, poor thing. That is often the wisest course," Miss Marple said gently. "Though one never quite escapes one's past, it has a way of following like a well-trained dog. Still, time softens even the harshest memories." Mrs. West buttered a scone with brisk efficiency. "And young Charles? The inspector says he's been sent away quietly. The vicar's arranged some business for him abroad to give him a fresh start." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, I imagine that will do him good. He was not born for deceit. Weakness, yes, but weakness is often curable. It's pride that's the lasting illness." Her companion looked at her curiously. "You never cease to amaze me, Jane. How you saw through it all. Why, no one else suspected poor Mrs. Burnham of anything." "Oh, but I never suspected her of murder," Miss Marple said, her tone mild. "Only of fear. People in fear are very tidy about what they touch and what they don't. I noticed, you see, that she never once referred to Mr. Harcourt by name after his death. That sort of omission always speaks volumes." Mrs. West chuckled softly. "You're a strange comfort, you know that. Always making me see the worst in people. And somehow, it makes me feel better about the world." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Perhaps because it reminds us that evil is rarely grand or dramatic. It's quite domestic, really. A little resentment here, a bit of cowardice there, and before long, someone's dead at tea. But most of the time," she added, stirring her cup, "people simply blunder into tragedy through misunderstanding. That, to me, is the saddest kind." For a moment, neither spoke. The church bell rang the hour, and the sound drifted through the still air like a sigh. A postman passed the gate, tipping his cap politely. Miss Marple watched him go, her expression soft, her thoughts far away. "Do you think," Mrs. West asked after a pause, "that people ever truly learn from such things?" Miss Marple smiled, setting down her teacup. A few do. Most simply grow more careful about what they say over tea. Mrs. West laughed, and for a time they sat in comfortable silence, the peaceful sort that comes only when a storm has passed. Later, when the sun began to dip behind the hedgerows and the shadows lengthened across the garden, Miss Marple gathered her knittings and rose. She looked toward the village, toward the neat chimneys and tidy windows glowing in the soft evening light. All seemed well again. Yet she knew, as she always did, that beneath the calm, hearts still whispered their secret fears and jealousies, their quiet loves and disappointments. That was human nature, unchanging and eternal, the same as the roses that bloomed and faded each season, beautiful and thorned alike. With a small, knowing smile, Miss Marple turned toward the vicarage door. "Come, Caroline," she said, "let's have one last pot of tea before supper. I find the world makes far more sense when viewed over china cups." And as they went inside, the garden fell still once more, save for the faint ticking of the clock through the open window, a gentle, steadfast reminder that time and truth always move on, 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 always move on.